This is Andrew Dobson. You might recognize him by his blue bear mascot, a cartoon version of himself that became almost as recognizable as the man behind it. For years, he was one of the internet's most recognizable autobiographical cartoonists. His webcomic, So You're a Cartoonist, reached millions of page views. He published graphic novels, he collaborated with major YouTube creators, his comics were shared across the internet, and his opinions regularly pulled thousands of people into the comments. At one point, almost everyone in online art circles knew exactly who Andrew Dobson was, but that wasn't because of his comics alone. Over time, his name became attached to one controversy after another. From political fights to public feuds, he became the most controversial bear face ever. Eventually, the reputation he spent years building became impossible to separate from the reputation he kept creating for himself. He became so problematic that his brother was allegedly denied a government job because of Dobson's views, and Dobson had to wipe himself off the internet after the authorities went after him. So, how does someone with real artistic talent, a loyal audience, and years of online success end up walking away from everything they built? To see how everything unfolded, we need to go back to how Andrew Dobson's story started. Andrew Dobson, also known as Tom Preston, was born in the spring of 1982 in Spencer, Massachusetts. He was the younger of two brothers when his family bought a Commodore 64 early, and that quickly became the center of his world. Even his first words were load and run because of it. By his teenage years, he had already taught himself stop-motion animation using Legos and an 8mm camera before moving into self-taught 2D and 3D animation. From the beginning, Andrew saw himself as someone with talent. The problem was that almost every story about his early life also came with someone making things harder for him. Like, he was bullied heavily throughout school. At one point, he casually mentioned being banned from the kindergarten school bus, although he never explained why. It's strange that he never explained this one incident because he usually explained absolutely everything else about his life. Like, he described being jumped by classmates and given humiliating nicknames throughout school, getting picked on for being quiet and shy, getting laughed at for standing up for myself, getting beaten up, getting given degrading nicknames that still haunt me to this day, the hate, the anger, and the desire to kill all my classmates. He also recalled finally snapping one day and punching one of his bullies. Then, almost immediately afterward, he turned himself in. One time I punched a guy who was bullying me and then promptly turned myself into the principal's office. That's the type of person I am. Even this early, a pattern was starting to form. Andrew could hold on to a conflict for years, retell it in detail, and turn it into part of his story. But in the moment itself, he often seemed more comfortable retreating than confronting it directly. That became even clearer when he enrolled at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design in 2000. His first roommate, Adam, regularly brought his girlfriend over, and they were anything but quiet. Instead of confronting either of them, Andrew chose to sleep in the stairwell. While he slept on the staircase, a girl offered him a place to sleep on the couch in her room. The same girl went on to become his girlfriend later. But what matters here isn't that someone made things hard for him, even during his college days. It's that Andrew's solution was not to confront the problem, but to remove himself from it completely. And years later, he retold the entire thing as a funny college story. That same habit showed up again when he ran the college's anime club during that same period. Every week, he selected new shows for screenings that lasted from 7 in the evening until midnight. He enjoyed the role enough to list it on his resume. The experience turned out to have another villain for him, just like school bullies and his uncomfortable roommate situation. The problem started when members began mocking almost every show he picked, including series he genuinely enjoyed. Hey everyone, and welcome to Anime Night. I've got a really special movie tonight. It's one of the first anime I ever saw, and it means a lot to me. Instead of arguing with them or trying to change the atmosphere, he slowly stopped attending his own screenings and handed responsibility to an assistant. According to Andrew, that assistant eventually ran the club into the ground after taking over. So once again, Andrew walked away from something he cared about. And once again, the story did not end when the conflict ended. He held onto it for years, turned it into a comic, and used the comic to explain why he had been wronged. So he left college carrying a grudge against anime itself. For nearly a decade, he repeatedly criticized the entire medium in public, even though his older posts showed he had once been obsessed with series like Dragon Ball. But while Andrew was publicly distancing himself from anime, he was privately building an identity that was much harder to explain. Around 2004, he had already spent several years lurking in a Yahoo group dedicated to body inflation fetish artwork. The community focused on drawings of characters inflating like balloons. He later said he had watched the community for close to a decade before finally uploading his first piece. It featured an inflated version of Lena Inverse from the Anime Slayers. Within just 15 days, Andrew completed 48 separate requests under the alias Catty N. The account quickly became popular, and it eventually evolved into Catty Nebulart, a recurring original character who appeared throughout his fetish comics. Unlike most inflation artwork, which simply showed characters becoming larger, Andrew's stories usually ended with the characters inflating until they exploded. When parts of the work violated DeviantArt's content rules, he simply moved the uncensored versions onto his own website. For years, many people people inside that community assumed Catty was a woman. Andrew usually answered honestly whenever someone directly asked whether he was male. However, one of his own posts admitted that he intentionally played along with the misunderstanding at least once because he thought it was funny. He even mentioned receiving messages from people who believed they were flirting with a woman. Then the private persona collided with his real life. In 2007, Andrew explained on the forum bodyinflation.org that he eventually told his girlfriend about Catty. According to him, she was immediately repulsed. Not long afterward, she found his popping artwork online herself. She came away believing the comics reflected an unhealthy fascination with hurting women. Andrew said the relationship never truly recovered after that conversation. Instead, they simply stopped talking about it altogether. Even years later, if something in a movie reminded her of those comics, she would quietly look at him without saying a word. And just like before, silence became the solution. Dobson did not resolve anything, he simply pushed it aside. I would beg to differ on that. I told my girlfriend with much embarrassment and she was quite repulsed by it. It didn't help that she went searching online shortly after that, stumbled across a lot of my popping artwork and thought I like to torture women. It's been a horrible strain on our relationship and I find myself burying it deeper and deeper and only coming out when she's not around, like now. I can honestly say that telling her was not a wise decision. That same year, in February 2007, Andrew reached a major milestone. He secured his first real publishing deal, marking the biggest step yet toward the creative career he had wanted since childhood. But that milestone also created a problem, because now the Catty account was no longer just a private internet persona. It was a risk to the professional image he was trying to build. Within days of announcing the deal, he quietly deleted the Catty DeviantArt account. He later admitted he considered the account too risky now that his real name carried professional value. He barely acknowledged the persona again for years. When he finally addressed it in a short FAQ on his main website, he confirmed that Catty had always been him. He then immediately asked people to move on. Looking back, this period already reveals a pattern that would define almost everything that followed. There was genuine talent and real ambition. There was also a growing habit of avoiding conflict instead of confronting it. Whenever his public image collided with uncomfortable reality, Andrew's first instinct was not to explain it, but to hide it until he no longer had a choice. Anyways, after the Catty account disappeared in 2007, Andrew Dobson spent the next several years rebuilding his public identity under the alias Tom Preston. He published several books through Lulu.com, including the Big Book of Stuffness and Legends Volume 1. In 2008, he reached another milestone when his first traditionally published graphic novel, Formera, was released through the small publisher Altera Comics. It looked like the beginning of the career he had always wanted. The reality was much less glamorous though. When he attended New York Comic Con that year, he sold only 7 copies over 2 days. Most of those sales came from his own mother and aunt, who bought copies just to hand them out to friends. So instead of becoming the breakout graphic novelist he imagined, Andrew was still stuck trying to make the career work however he could. The graphic novel hadn't become the breakthrough he'd hoped for, so he continued relying on freelance commissions. Around that same period, he accepted a paid commission based on Metroid. The illustration took 4 months to complete, but viewers later noticed traced elements within the finished artwork. That detail would seem minor at the time. Later, it would look much more like a warning sign. Anyways, on January 1st, 2011, Andrew launched the project that would define the rest of his online career, the webcomic So You're a Cartoonist chronicled his daily life as a working artist. It mixed autobiography with humor and quickly found an audience. His DeviantArt account passed 1 million page views that same year. Around the same time, he also began a 3-year collaboration with musician and YouTuber Brental Floss. He illustrated comics that reached a much larger audience than anything he had created before. Here again, things finally seemed to be moving in the right direction, but there was something unusual about the comics themselves. Whenever someone criticized him, he never addressed it honestly. Instead, he rewrote it into neat little 4-panel arguments where his side always came out looking correct. It worked well inside a comic, but that is not how real life works. He learned that lesson in May 2012 when DeviantArt selected Andrew for its Fresh Doodles promotional group and flew him to MCM London, one of the UK's largest comic conventions. To celebrate, he created a poster featuring famous British landmarks and pop culture icons. Before the convention even began, he uploaded both the sketch and the finished artwork online. People on 4chan quickly compared his drawing of Big Ben to a specific stock photograph. The similarities were difficult to ignore. The angle matched almost perfectly. The proportions lined up almost exactly. Even much of the shading appeared nearly identical. Within days, musician Ken Ashcorp released a short parody song mocking the tracing allegations. The video switched back and forth between the stock photograph and Andrew's artwork while highlighting just how closely they matched.
Goes to sell them at conventions. 5 minutes in Photoshop. I hope you die on your way to MCM.
The clip spread rapidly across the internet. The worst part about this song, it's way too short. Grandfather will sing that to their grandchildren for generations to come. And suddenly, the convention trip that was supposed to prove Andrew was a serious artist became the thing putting his work under a microscope. On May 15th, Andrew posted his response. He acknowledged that people had located the reference photograph, but argued that critics had become obsessed with finding flaws in his work. He also claimed that any accurate drawing of Big Ben would naturally resemble other photographs of the landmark. But this defense completely missed the point. Nobody was saying Andrew couldn't draw Big Ben. The issue was that his poster appeared to match one specific photo almost perfectly. So instead of explaining his process, Andrew shifted the argument into something much safer, whether famous landmarks tend to look alike. With only days remaining before MCM London, he uploaded another response. This time, he filmed himself drawing Big Ben completely by hand using traditional tools. Here's my conundrum. If I redraw it on paper, what's going to prevent people from claiming foul again? Unless I record it as a Ustream and upload it to YouTube sped up so you can see me drawing it, I don't know of how else to prove that I am capable of such detail. Also, the stigma that I trace will probably linger on long after this settles anyway. But it also created a new problem. It proved the one thing nobody had really questioned. The issue wasn't whether Andrew could draw architecture, it was why the poster looked so close to one specific photograph in the first place. And his response still hadn't explained that. Ken Ashcorp clearly wasn't satisfied either. On May 23rd, he released a longer commentary titled Sins of a Complacent Artist. Ken's point was that Andrew had genuine ability but repeatedly chose shortcuts instead of using it. The creator contrasted Andrew with Andrew Chesworth, one of his former classmates from MCAD. By then, Chesworth had achieved the exact career Andrew had dreamed about since childhood by working as an animator at Disney. Andrew attended MCM London anyway, 5 days after that video appeared. A masked individual approached his booth and sprayed him with liquid from a bottle before running away. The person later explained that the original plan had simply been to hand Andrew a note reading, "This is what reading your comics feels like." When the footage reached Tumblr, it caused a mixed reaction. At the time, Andrew mostly described the incident as an unpleasant moment during an already stressful convention. The second incident was a hit and run. "I was minding my own business doing sketch cards for fans when someone pushed through the crowd, sprayed me with what I hope was water from a water bottle, and took off running after throwing down some manifesto of some sort, which I didn't even bother to read. So nice, wasted effort there, man." So that was the second thing that happened. Years later, however, his description changed. He began referring to it as a coordinated physical attack that gave him PTSD. He specifically connected that trauma to the fact that the incident had been filmed and shared online. The convention ended, but Andrew's reputation had started changing. More people now knew him because of controversy than because of his comics. And once that reputation started forming, every new incident became easier for people to interpret through the same lens. The following year brought another controversy, and this one connected directly back to a part of his past he had largely left behind. By August 2013, Andrew had openly discussed creating comics about controversial political topics because they consistently attracted more attention than his other work. On August 18th, he published a comic titled Asking for It. The strip showed a Power Girl cosplayer being harassed by a convention attendee who kept taking unwanted photographs. Andrew wrote himself into the comic as the person who noticed the situation and stepped in to defend her. The backlash was immediate. Many readers pointed out an obvious contradiction. Andrew had spent years creating fetish artwork centered on women being inflated against their will. Now he was presenting himself as a heroic defender of women against harassment. Andrew also repeatedly insisted that no real event had inspired the comic. According to him, the entire scenario came from his imagination and had no connection to any real convention or cosplayer. That explanation remained unchanged for 6 years. Then, in 2019, a photograph surfaced. The image showed a woman dressed as Power Girl comfortably posing for photographs during a convention. What appeared to be Andrew could also be seen standing in the background. So apparently, a real and completely consensual photo opportunity existed that closely resembled elements of the story Andrew had insisted was entirely fictional. That alone already made his original explanation much harder to believe. But the situation looked even worse when people realized the cosplayer's photo was taken by her boyfriend, not a harasser. A year after publishing the comic, Andrew defended it again. He pointed to convention posters warning attendees about harassment and argued they validated the message of his strip. He framed continued criticism as if people were defending harassment itself. Once again, that completely sidestepped the actual concern people had. Nobody argued harassment was acceptable. People questioned whether Andrew had any credibility to cast himself as the hero of that story, given his own artistic history. They also questioned whether he had been truthful about where the idea came from. By this point, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. In both cases, a direct answer could have ended the conversation situation early. Instead, Andrew built an entirely different argument and spent years defending that version rather than the original issue. In August 2014, Zoe Quinn, an independent game developer, became the center of a massive online controversy after her ex-boyfriend published a long blog post accusing her of infidelity and alleging she had inappropriate relationships with games journalists. The claims about trading sex for positive reviews were never substantiated, but they spread rapidly online. From there, the situation exploded into Gamergate. Supporters of Gamergate argued they were campaigning for ethics in games journalism. Critics argued the movement quickly became associated with widespread harassment, particularly targeting women in gaming, including Zoe Quinn, Brianna Wu, and Anita Sarkeesian. Andrew immediately sided with Zoe Quinn. Within days, he published lengthy posts defending Zoe Quinn and criticizing the controversy that had formed around the movement. In one post, he compared Quinn's situation to the suicide of actor Robin Williams. He argued that both involved people acting against their own values because of overwhelming outside pressure. The comparison landed poorly. Many readers felt he had stretched an unrelated tragedy far beyond its context in order to strengthen his own argument. But instead of making his point stronger, it mostly distracted from the issue he was trying to talk about. And it would not be the last time Andrew reached for a dramatic comparison and made the situation worse. Only a few weeks later, he made another mistake. He publicly blamed Gamergate supporters for an unrelated crime. When it became clear they had nothing to do with it, Andrew apologized and admitted he had jumped to the wrong conclusion. And for a brief moment, it looked like the mistake might actually change how he saw the movement. He even suggested that some of Gamergate's concerns may have been worth considering. But that version of Andrew didn't last long. Within days, he was right back where he started. Soon afterward, he returned completely to his original position. By now, Andrew had become deeply invested in the conflict itself. Every new controversy pulled him further into it, and the more involved he became, the less his account looked like the page of a working cartoonist and the more it looked like a running commentary on the internet's latest culture war. The biggest turning point came in September. Andrew published a comic mocking Vivian James, the character that had become Gamergate's unofficial mascot. The strip portrayed Vivian as secretly supporting the same problems the movement claimed to oppose. Alongside her, Andrew included a caricature of a struggling college graduate blaming Wall Street for personal debt instead of accepting responsibility. The backlash was enormous. It easily surpassed the reaction to the Big Ben tracing controversy. Within days, artists across the internet began creating parody artwork that reimagined Andrew's own characters in increasingly hostile ways. For the first time, thousands of people who had never heard of Andrew Dobson suddenly knew exactly who he was. Don't you dare drag Luigi into this, Dobson. In typical Dobson style, he crashes and burns, missing the point. What an unfunny jackass he is. Go away, you feckless hack. No one wants you latching on us like a lamprey. Ironically, the attention he had spent years trying to earn as a cartoonist only came because people were mocking his cartoons instead. And once that happened, the conflict became almost impossible for him to step away from. On October 12th, after Zoe Quinn's personal information was leaked online without her consent, Andrew published a message directed at any Gamergate supporters who followed him. He told them to unfollow immediately. He described the leak as a line he refused to cross and presented the statement as absolute. The very next day, he apologized for how harsh the post had come across. Less than 24 hours after drawing a firm line, he was already walking it back. Around this point, even Andrew's online identity started looking different. Around 2012, he had already started replacing his human self insert with a blue bear in "So You're a Cartoonist." He explained that readers spent too much time commenting on his appearance. His comic version had looked much younger and thinner than he actually was for years, so the bear solved that problem entirely. By 2015, the blue bear had become much more than a character. Andrew briefly rebranded himself online as the SJW bear and leaned heavily into the identity. He regularly posted jokes aimed at white people and argued they were harmless because he himself was white. He also complained that people would not let him joke about white people, even though he was white himself. But the more Andrew made race part of his online persona, the more toxic those conversations became. Some replies crossed the line completely, including people using racial slurs against him. That was obviously unacceptable, but it also showed how far Andrew's account had drifted from art and into constant culture war arguments. People stopped seeing Andrew as just a cartoonist. More and more, they saw him as the guy constantly arguing about whatever controversy was taking over the internet that week. And his own Twitter account made that harder to deny. Andrew publicly claimed he only spent around 30 or 40 minutes a day on Twitter, but around the same time, his account activity was exploding. In early 2015, his account showed roughly 3,150 tweets and 760 followers. 5 months later, that had passed 11,000 tweets, close to 1,500 a month. And by April 2016, he had crossed 28,000 tweets total, while still sitting at just over 1,300 followers. When people pointed this out, Andrew argued that judging him by tweet count was unfair. He compared it to judging YouTubers for uploading every day, but that comparison only made sense if Twitter was supposed to be his main creative outlet, and that was exactly the problem. A lot of Andrew's activity was not new art, new comics, or new projects projects, it was replies, retweets, arguments, and posts pulled from political hashtags. So whether he was actually spending 30 minutes a day on Twitter or much longer almost became beside the point. It was that being online had become the work. The comic artist who once wanted attention for his original stories was now getting attention for arguments, call-outs, and whatever discourse he had attached himself to. And that same pattern started showing up outside politics too, because around the same time, Andrew became intensely focused on the legend of Korra. More specifically, it centered on the relationship between Korra and Asami during the show's 4th and final season. Andrew had shown relatively little interest in the series beforehand. Hard to say really. Dobson wasn't even that big a fan of Korra in the beginning, and only really started caring about it mid-season 3, I believe. Once the relationship became central to the ending, he started posting about it almost every day. And in December, he also released a supercut lasting more than an hour. The video stitched together every scene Korra and Asami shared throughout the entire series. He also published an extensive breakdown explaining what he believed a full rewatch revealed. One detail appeared again and again. Andrew repeatedly emphasized that Korra and Asami were bisexual rather than gay. He mentioned that distinction so frequently, it became one of the things people remembered him for. Later, he produced a fully hand-drawn animation showing one character proposing to the other. The scene used audio taken directly from one of the show's voice actresses. Given Andrew's history, creating fetish artwork centered on women, many people found his intense fixation on Korrasami uncomfortable. That was a painful lesbian manga inspired to get through. They questioned why this particular relationship had become such a dominant part of his online presence. I just think of Dobson in one battle after another going, "You like lesbians? I love them. I love them." But Andrew's answer never changed. He insisted he was simply an enthusiastic fan and dismissed any other interpretation as prejudice or homophobia. By 2015, this was Andrew's biggest problem. The more he reacted to controversy, the more those reactions became his reputation. And because there were fewer major creative projects pulling attention elsewhere, every bad tweet, bad comic, or badly timed opinion started to define him more than the art itself. On April 29, 2015, Zelda Williams, the daughter of the late Robin Williams, posted about having a difficult week on Twitter. Less than a year after her father's death, she wrote that grief sometimes made her laugh and sometimes left her feeling completely lost. Andrew replied with an image of the female version of Marvel's Thor, which was captioned as "Calm thine tits." Unsurprisingly, this time, the criticism extended well beyond the communities that usually argued with him. Andrew initially defended the tweet across several follow-up posts by insisting people had misunderstood what he meant. Then he deleted it. The following day, he posted a brief apology confirming the tweet had been removed and admitting it had come across as kind of rude. But by then, the explanation barely mattered. The tweet had already spread and the damage was done. And this became another example of the same problem. Andrew would step into a sensitive situation, make himself part of it, then spend the aftermath arguing over how people interpreted his response. That same habit also shaped the way he attached himself to other people inside the culture war circles he followed. One of the clearest examples was comic writer Brianna Wu, another prominent figure during the Gamergate era. He regularly supported her positions in public and often referenced her work. The attention was almost entirely one-sided. Brianna Wu never followed him back. That August, one of Andrew's older comics resurfaced. The strip featured a man dressed as Slav Leia and was widely criticized as transphobic. Wu publicly expressed her disapproval. Andrew apologized directly to her and asked his followers to help correct what he believed was a misunderstanding surrounding the comic. A few months later, they disagreed again. This time, the argument centered on spoilers for Star Wars: The Force Awakens. Wu argued that extreme anti-spoiler attitudes had become irrational. Andrew pushed back by saying it felt selfish to expect people who had not yet seen the movie to simply accept spoilers. He also explained that he could not afford a ticket at the time. Afterward, Andrew described the disagreement as leaving him kind of bummed. Andrew seemed to take the exchange far more personally than Brianna Wu ever did, but this was becoming normal for him. By this point, Andrew was constantly attaching himself to internet arguments, picking a side early and treating every new update like proof that his side had been right all along. That became obvious again in 2016, when the all-female Ghostbusters reboot turned into one of the internet's biggest culture war debates before most people had even seen it. Andrew was already defending the movie long before it premiered, so when the first wave of positive reviews came out, he immediately treated them like vindication. Then, after finally watching it, he latched onto Kate McKinnon's character, Holtzman, who many viewers interpreted as gay. He praised the character repeatedly and even changed his display name online to reference her directly. But the movie itself did not become the victory lap Andrew seemed to expect. It struggled with both critics and audiences and eventually became one of the year's biggest disappointments. Even then, Andrew kept presenting the film in the most favorable way possible. And that was the problem. The movie was no longer just a movie to him. It had become another argument he had publicly invested himself himself in. So walking it back would have meant admitting that the people he had spent months arguing with might not have been completely wrong. Then came November 2016. Donald Trump was elected president of the United States. Andrew reacted harshly to Trump winning the presidential elections. He told any followers who had voted for Trump to unfollow him and described their politics as disgustingly hateful. That same night, he began drawing political comics about the election. It was the same reflex again. Whenever a major public event happened, Andrew processed it by turning his reaction into content. He also told Kanye West directly that no sane black man would support Trump. By this point, almost every major news story had become another stage for Andrew to perform his own reaction in real time. His Twitter account continued growing throughout this period. By 2018, it had accumulated well over 42,000 tweets across roughly 7 years. In May of that year, the account was permanently suspended following a coordinated mass reporting campaign. Andrew attempted to return several times through new accounts, but none of those attempts lasted, and even losing Twitter became another controversy for him to frame through a dramatic comparison. One of his final public comments about the suspension compared it to director James Gunn losing his job over old social media posts earlier that same year, but the comparison did not really work. James Gunn had lost a major studio job. Andrew had lost a Twitter account after years of hostile online arguments. Still, Andrew justified it by saying his account was suspended because of his posts against President Donald Trump. After losing Twitter, Andrew shifted much of his activity to Facebook and Tumblr. Not long afterward, gaming commentator Total Biscuit died following a long and very public battle with cancer. Andrew responded on Facebook by discussing his own mixed emotions. He specifically pointed to Total Biscuit's past support for Gamergate as something that complicated his ability to mourn without reservations. Predictably, the response was overwhelmingly negative. To a lot of people, Andrew had taken a moment that should have been about Total Biscuit's family, friends, and community and turned it into a post about his own history with Gamergate. And that became even harder to defend when someone asked whether Andrew and Total Biscuit had ever actually interacted in any meaningful way. Andrew admitted he could not really remember. So the backlash was not just about him criticizing a dead creator, it was about the fact that even after losing Twitter, Andrew was still doing the same thing somewhere else. A public tragedy happened, and instead of stepping back, he found a way to pull it back into the same internet war that had already consumed so much of his identity. By 2018, that's exactly where his reputation stood. In February of that year, a Tumblr blog, The Hypocrisy of Andrew Dobson, appeared with a title that left very little room for interpretation. The blog was trying to collect every controversy involving Andrew Dobson in one place, and that was what made it so damaging. None of these incidents were new on their own. People had argued about Andrew for years, but now, instead of being scattered across old forum threads, deleted posts, and forgotten screenshots, they were all being organized into one long record. Its creator began documenting Andrew's public history in extraordinary detail. Instead of looking like isolated mistakes, his actions now form one continuous pattern, stretching across more than a decade. For years, Andrew had told countless stories about his own life. This was the first time someone else assembled those stories into a version he could no longer control. And unfortunately for Andrew, there was not enough new work to change the conversation. By this point, Andrew's creative output had slowed dramatically. His comic websites disappeared for long stretches at a time. He had largely stopped pursuing graphic novels as a serious career path. Instead, he occasionally teased a mysterious new project. He described it as focusing on a black woman alongside magical creatures and, at one point, even mentioned the possibility of Muslim vampires. But no release date ever seemed to stick. Around the same period, Andrew completed a 3-chapter animated adaptation of The Adventure Zone, the popular Dungeons & Dragons podcast. The project showed real effort and technical ability, but it also focused entirely on somebody else's work. Meanwhile, his own long-promised original project remained unfinished. Even now, Andrew seemed more comfortable expanding another creator's world than fully committing to his own. Dobson can't even make a coherent comic. Then, in April 2020, after years of delays and abandoned ideas, Andrew finally released the project people had been waiting on. Now titled Cabin Rest, it abandoned the traditional comic format entirely. Instead, the story unfolded through what appeared to be a character's real Twitter feed. The comic launched as exclusive content for paying Patreon supporters. By almost any measure, this was Andrew's most ambitious original work in years. He had spent nearly 2 years developing it, and for once, it looked like he had actually followed through. But the comeback barely lasted a week. Pages from the comic leaked outside the Patreon paywall and quickly spread across the same blogs that had documented Andrew for years. He did not discover the leak immediately. By the time he learned about it on May 15th, the pages had already been circulating for roughly a month. And when he finally reacted, his solution only made the situation stranger. Instead of addressing the leak itself, Andrew raised the minimum Patreon pledge required to access Cabin Rest to $5,000. The move changed nothing. The leaked pages remained online and existing copies continued spreading. The only real consequence was was that legitimate supporters could no longer subscribe. It solved the smallest part of the problem while leaving the largest part completely untouched. 6 days later, Andrew published another statement. He wrote that a small group of people will not leave me alone no matter how many times I ask. He described them as harassers and stalkers. He also explained that the constant exposure felt impossible to escape because it existed entirely online and almost entirely through anonymous users. To Andrew, it looked like proof that no matter what he made, the same people would always be waiting to tear it apart. Then came the post that finally brought everything to an end. On May 22nd, 2020, Andrew posted what became his final public statement. "They win," he wrote. He explained that he would leave his existing accounts online only to prevent anyone else from taking his username. Beyond that, he said he was finished. He briefly replied to a handful of supporters before disappearing. During those conversations, Andrew revealed that he had been in therapy since 2013. He also said that whatever he was experiencing now had moved beyond what therapy alone could solve. In his own words, he believed he had only two options. He could abandon both his art and his online presence forever, or he could choose something worse. Either way, he concluded, the result would be exactly the same. They win, he loses. I need more than well wishes. I need something physical and concrete to change. I don't know what else to do anymore. Whether someone agrees with Andrew's conclusions or not, one part of his experience deserves to be acknowledged. Living under years of constant scrutiny, dedicated hate blogs, and massive forum threads would be exhausting for almost anyone. That kind of attention carries a real psychological cost. Over the following weeks, Andrew disappeared piece by piece. His Patreon page was shut down and converted into a standard user account. One after another, his websites went offline. So, You're a Cartoonist, Alex the Pirate, and Formera all disappeared. Even Cabin Rest, the project he had spent 2 years completing, vanished alongside everything else. Most of his work survived only because other people had archived it. Ironically, many of those archives were maintained by the same critics who had spent years documenting his controversies. Without them, much of Andrew's career might have disappeared completely. There was also an unverified rumor that he wiped himself off the internet because his brother had been denied a government job despite qualifying, allegedly because of Dobson's controversial political beliefs. Not so fun fact, there are rumors that his family is the reason why he never emerged from the internet again. Why? Because his brother lost a job opportunity when his employer saw all his posts and comics threatening politicians to off themselves to remedy the situation his family told him to touch grass. For almost 5 years, Andrew Dobson vanished from the internet. Then, in February 2025, something changed. A Blue Sky account using the handle @comics appeared online. Its first post strongly suggested Andrew might finally be returning. The account generated genuine attention after such a long absence. More posts appeared in late March. Then, just as suddenly, they stopped. Its final message described years of therapy that had gone nowhere and expressed regret over trying to return at all. For a moment, it looked like Andrew's story had come full circle. After years of silence, he had returned to the internet, tried to explain himself, immediately regretted it, and disappeared all over again. But there was only one problem. The account was fake. It had never belonged to Andrew in the first place. That may be the strangest ending of all. Even the story of Andrew Dobson's possible return was written by somebody else. People believed it because it sounded exactly like something he would have said. Looking back across 20 years, the pattern feels surprisingly consistent. Andrew clearly had artistic ability. He worked hard at times. He found audiences that many creators never reach. None of those things were ever really in doubt. What repeatedly held him back was his attention-seeking behavior in every situation and making it revolve around him. Dobson is what happens when a guy who can draw thinks he can make comics with no other abilities. For 2 decades, Andrew Dobson kept trying to protect the version of himself he wanted people to see. In the end, protecting that image cost him almost everything he built around it. He didn't actually leave the internet. He just inflated himself with so much copium he finally burst.